So the last time that we did one of these, I talked about the things that blow your mind about God, at least one concept of that. And I thought it would be interesting to go through some books that God has used in my life that have really taken that concept of the mind-warping nature of God and taken that to other degrees or got my imagination going. I feel that if you do not capture the imagination with God, your imagination will be captured by other things, and therefore you'll be pulled into lesser things in life. And the degree of damage that does in a life depends on how far you drift. We want our imagination, our mind to be captivated by God. And some good books will help do that. In my life, one of the books that I think first really did that back as a new believer in my early 20s, I was reading C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity. And this book, I don't know why, but the spot that stuck out to me that really got in my head was when he starts speaking, when C.S. Lewis is talking about dealing with our prayers. How can 100 million people pray to God and God deal with all those things? How does he go about that? Well, let me read a little line that C.S. Lewis says here, one that really got in my head and never has really let go. He said, "Almost certainly God is not in time." And for me, that just did it. I was like, wait, what? His life does not consist of moments, one following after another. Then further, he says, if you picture time as a straight line along which we have to travel, then you must picture God as the whole page on which the line is drawn. For me, as I said, as a new believer, somebody really initially exploring the nature of God, this was just, this was awesome. This set off a fire in my mind and got my imagination going in ways that very few things ever have. God is awesome, and He is unexplainable, and He's outside of the reach of our imagination. Very good book for me, and probably for a great number of all of you. Another book, this book was interesting, R.C. Sproul, The Holiness of God. This book was really interesting in my life because it was probably the first time I ever picked up a book and then didn't put it down until I read the whole thing. The book is, 260 pages long, and I didn't realize it was that long at the time because I remember I sat down to read it. I believe I was sick, and I started to read it, and all I had was like a cup of hot tea or something with me, I think it was, and a blanket. And I just sat there and I read, and then I didn't eat or anything. I just kept reading through. I think I fell asleep at one point, woke up and went back to reading. Read all the way through this. This book on the holiness of God was a fire set in me that was such a grace from God. And I'm forever thankful that R.C. Sproul sought out to write this book, that he took the time to write it, and it has affected so many lives ever since. Wonderful book. I would recommend very highly. And no list like this would be complete without Knowing God by J.I. Packer. It says right on the cover, over 1 million copies sold. The problem with this book is that over 1 million copies have been sold, and I wonder how many of those have been read. This has fallen into the Christian classic category, which means for a lot of people, you buy it and you put it on your shelf and it collects dust. Please, crack the cover of this book. If you haven't in a long time, read it again. And if you're like me, I very rarely, honestly, read cover to cover. I helicopter in on a section that's interesting to me, like in chapter 7, and then I start reading backwards. Maybe I'm dyslexic. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I often end up doing that. And then maybe I don't even end up reading the whole book, and then I go back to it later. I don't know if I've ever actually sat down and just read this straight through. I've read it. I've returned to it over and over. I've read a chunk here and a chunk there, and then go back and think about it. Anyway, point is, it's rolling around in my brain all the time. It's one of those books that's gotten in there and is never totally let go. This is this quote I wanted to read isn't so much a reflection on the nature of God, but just it's one of those sections of a book that took root in my mind, and I kind of come back to it on a reoccurring basis like a broken record. Here, in speaking of the fact that we have no grasp on the grace of God, he says, modern men and women, conscious of their tremendous scientific achievements in recent years, naturally incline to a high opinion of themselves. They view material wealth as, in any case, more important than moral character. And in the moral realm, they are more resolutely kind to themselves, treating small virtues as compensating for great vices, and refusing to take seriously the idea that, morally speaking, there is anything much wrong with them. Consider how true this is. Consider how, as you look around at life and everything else and the people that you know and you love, you consider how true that is, how much we put a priority on the external and the moral things. We tend to think, that we're good people. On the basis of what? On the basis of comparing ourselves to the worst possible person around. The thought of themselves as creatures fallen from God's image, rebels against God's rule, guilty and unclean in God's sight, fit only for God's condemnation, never enters their minds. This was effective in planting a seed for evangelism more in my life. I assumed everybody knew they were a bad person. My default was to know that I was a sinner. Grew up hearing truth, hearing about God, hearing the law and things of that nature. And so I assumed most people knew they were sinners. And the more I talked and the more I spoke to people about Christ, the more I realized the problem, in a lot of ways, they didn't think they were bad. They didn't think they really needed a Savior. And that section there, as I said, is a spot I keep rolling back around to, and makes me marvel at the goodness and kindness of God and His grace dispensed to us. Awesome book. Another book that was wonderful, instrumental in my own heart on a regular basis, it seems like now, is a book written by Bruce Ware called Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. When he speaks of the nature of Christ incarnate here in His earthly ministry, that for me was, I don't even know what to call it. Except that it felt like a breath of fresh air. I think I had failed to consider the nature of Christ's humanity. I understood His deity quite well in my thinking, and I had naturally thought of Him from that perspective, but didn't think much as far as what He really endured in His human nature. One section of the book that has caught hold in my heart is found here in the middle section of the book, where he says, freedom is not what our culture tells us it is. Freedom is not deciding from the urges and longings of my sinful nature to do what I want to do, when I want to do it, how I want to do it, with whom I want to do it. According to the Bible, that is bondage, not freedom. That's so tremendous, because it's all that perspective change that happens after the cross. Once you've embraced Christ, the perspective just has inverted. And so what do we consider to be truly freedom? Bible considers what the world defines as freedom as bondage. However, continuing with this thought, rather, true freedom is living as Jesus lived. Now, I love this part. For He is the freest human being who ever lived. In fact, He is the only fully free human being who has ever lived. That's a thought that I don't think, as a red-blooded American male, I think about freedom a lot, and I think about the limitations and stuff that are in our lives and as a result of government and such. And so I think of freedom. I love freedom. I love those opportunities to do and to be and to explore and all of that. And to think about that which is true freedom is a worthwhile exercise. It's a wonderful thing to meditate upon. And completing this list is the book, The Knowledge of the Holy by A.W. Tozer. I wish I had better words and more things to say here, to be more eloquent. I don't have it. What I do have is a great thankfulness in my heart at the opportunity to have read this book many times and to have shared it in small groups and other opportunities like that. This book spends its time meditating on different thoughts of God, knowing who He is, exploring those hard to reach things. Oftentimes things that I don't take the time to slow down enough and read. And this is not a long book. This book is about 100 pages. You can get it for like $5 or $6 on Amazon. They have different copies of it and all of that. But this book is so worth your time and so worth you passing it on to someone else. I would encourage reading this and going through these attributes of God with someone else. But then again, maybe that's because I'm a very auditory type of learner. I've got to pass it on or I don't really learn it as well. Towards the end of the book, and speaking of the justice of God, this thought rocked me when he says, to think of God as we sometimes think of a court, where a kindly judge, compelled by law, sentences a man to death with tears and apologies, is to think in a manner wholly unworthy of the true God. God is never at cross purposes with himself. No attribute of God is in conflict with another. In other words, God isn't embarrassed about hell. We tend to back away from hard doctrines. We tend to shy up, and I might share Christ with somebody and even tell them they're a sinner, but tell them they're damned to hell because of their sin. That's not the quickest way to earn a friend. And when reading that in the knowledge of the holy, that was one of those thoughts. I closed the book, pushed it back, sat back for a minute, and just had to think and pray. And I think those are the best books in the world. The books that you actually have to shut, reflect, pray, and go to the Word. And any book that's going to push you back to the Bible is a gift for us as His children. These are books that have influenced me. I would love to hear the books that influence you and have provoked you to consider God and who He is, the wonder of the Almighty. Share those in the comment section. Share those with me in person at church. I would love to hear that. I'm always reading books, and I would love to read more great books. Thank you for joining me, and I hope this has been encouraging. I'm not expecting anybody to read all these books, but if this would help kindle a fire in you to read another great book, awesome, then my work is done. We'll see you next time.